to another episode of Bass Fishing for Noobs as part of the Paddle and Fin podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Susie Q. Unfortunately, we do not have Sean with us today. If you guys all could keep him in your thoughts, your prayers, whatever you guys believe in or whatnot. Many of you guys may not know, his mom passed this past Monday, so definitely going to need lots of thoughts and prayers and warm thoughts sending his way. So he'll be, he'll be gone from the show just for a little bit, but hopefully we'll have him back here soon, so you get to deal with my lovely face and voice for a little while. But wanted to kind of share with you guys just a little bit again. If you guys haven't been with us for a little bit here, we do have some dates set. If I can get my window set here, bear with me here. I haven't done a solo show in quite a while, so this is a little bit different. Anywho, we have the date set for next year's Open on the world famous Dale Hollow Lake in Tennessee. So mark your calendars now. Get your PTO put in. Saturday, April 27th, Sunday, April 28th. Of course, hosted by the folks at Eastport Marina. We had the biggest 2-day payout. And I mean each day payout for big bass. Day 1 was over $2,000. Day 2 was over $2,000. And I think first place was, almost close to $2,000 as well. I mean, of course, the guy who won the tournament this year just knocked it all out of the park and walked away with almost, $7,000. But anywho, mark your calendars, get your time off, come down, spend the spring 2024, Dale Hollow, April 27th, April 28th. Come on down to Dale Hollow, Tennessee, where the awesomeness is going to happen. So, on this episode of Paddle and Fin for Noobs, we have a very special guest. And if you may not remember, we had a special guest, Scylla Johnson, had mentioned she knew this gentleman who we had reached out to, Mr. John Odenkirk. Welcome to the show, John. Glad to have you here. I think you might be... Oh, there you go. Now you're unmuted. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here, Susie. Thanks for inviting me along.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, John, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, how you got into it, all that fun stuff, and we'll jump right on in.
Well, I've got the dream job. I am living the dream. I'm fond of, and I didn't hear this from anybody. I actually made it up myself, which, I'm not the brightest one, but I like to say I'm never working and I'm always working, because that's a fact. My life and my job are so intertwined that it's hard to differentiate. I mean, I still have to fill out a time recording form for the agency, but honestly, like now, I mean, I'm not recording. This time is not going to go down as working time, but this is my life. Since I was a little wee lad, fishing in the ponds and creeks near my house, I ended up at Virginia Tech. I'm from Virginia. Got a bachelor's in fisheries. Went to graduate school in Tennessee, where I caught a giant smallmouth bass in Dale Hollow Reservoir when I was in graduate school with my professor. Only one fish that either of us caught that whole trip, but it was a beautiful smallmouth. And I got out of graduate school, went to Florida, worked on sturgeon and striped bass for a while on Panama City Beach, the Redneck Riviera. Loved it, but had to leave in 3 years because my wife hated it. And came back to Virginia, where we're both from. And that was a long time ago. It's scary to think how long I've been now with this agency, DWR. Crazy, but I'm doing what I always kind of dreamed and hoped I would do. I'm managing a small 12-county district in the area where I grew up and fished as a kid. Some of the same resources where I caught my first this or that species. I'm now managing those resources, and it's pretty cool. It's been a pleasure, and I have a lot of gratitude for the ability to be able to do that. And so I try to share what I know with my constituents, because Virginia is still one of the few hook and bullet agencies out there. Most state game and fish agencies have gone to some other alternative funding mechanisms, and Virginia is relatively unique. Not that that's a good thing right now, but we're still sponsored completely by sportsmen, fishermen, anglers, boaters, hunters. And so I've got basically two jobs. I want to make fishing good because y'all are paying my salary, and I want to conserve the resource for future generations. And usually those things match up pretty well. 1% of the time, maybe not, but most of the time they do. So anyway, and then this, So anything you want to ask me, I'm wide open.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit like what your days look like.
Well, my days are actually pretty cool because they're very diverse and unique. And having 12 counties, essentially the upper elevation of my work area, I've got wild brook trout habitat. That's happens to be the Virginia state fish, our only native salmonid on the East Coast, the brook trout. And so tomorrow or the next day, I might be doing a backpack electrofishing survey of a wild brook trout stream and something you could jump over. And then the next day, I'll be on a big rig on the tidal river, maybe chasing striped bass or snakeheads or tidal largemouth bass or anything in between. We've got public fishing reservoirs that we own or manage. We've got non-tidal rivers where smallmouth bass are the premier fishery. We've got tidal systems where largemouth bass and now snakeheads are premier fishery with bowfin, a native unique fish we have along the southeast part of this country. It's really cool, and I'm blessed to have such a diverse. You never get bored. I'll tell you that. You never get bored.
I bet not. So when you're doing your surveys, what exactly, what data are you collecting? And what are your main what are your main goals and objectives for what you're doing each time you go out in the field?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for asking that. And so the people that are listening, these are not typed up questions. I have no idea what she's going to ask me. This is something that is so overlooked, and something when I give presentations to angler groups or constituents that I try to drive home, because we spend a lot of our time collecting data. But if we're not collecting our data in a way that are meaningful, then we're wasting our time and your time because you're paying me. So when we're out there on the water, primarily, most of the time we're using a gear called electrofishing. It could be a backpack, it could be a tote barge, it could be a big boat unit, but we're putting electricity in the water to stun fish, AKA get a sample of fish. And then the two things we're primarily interested in is abundance. And that's usually, we couch that with this term relative abundance. It's not absolute. Usually we can't tell you exactly how many fish are in this body of water. Sometimes we can if we do like a marker capture experiment or something. But most of the time we're working on this thing called relative abundance, which is the number of fish that we catch per some unit of effort. For some people, that's 100 meters of shoreline. For us, it's per fish per hour. And so we'll do a bunch of runs, of replicate runs, so we'll get a sum of variance about an average, so we can have a meaningful comparison with last year or this lake or whatever. And so what we're doing is we're doing these transects with this electrofishing gear, and we're stunning fish, not hurting them, put them in a live well. When we're done with the run, we measure them, because that's the second most important thing, is size structure. So those are the two big things we're interested in: relative abundance and size structure. With those two things only, we can pretty much manage a fishery. Sometimes we need additional information. And the three things that drive any population are recruitment, that's birth rate, growth, and then mortality. If you know those three things, you can describe any population and manage it completely, satisfactorily within its carrying capacity. So sometimes we need to do other things, like maybe tag a fish or maybe sacrifice a fish to get certain information that we wouldn't normally be able to get. But typically those are not the main things we're interested in. Are size structure and abundance. And that's why when we only have a narrow window of time, say for largemouth bass, they're vulnerable because electrophysians is shallow water gear. And typically largemouth bass and other centrarchids in that family spawn in shallow water. So there's a window of time in the spring when those fish are vulnerable to our electrofishing gear. And so most of our surveys are done between early to mid-April and early to mid-May. So we've got 1 month to knock out, and that's why things have to go on a rotation depending on the priority of a given resource. Some resources, like say Lake Anna in Virginia, is that's my largest reservoir that I manage. It's 10,000 acres, and people come from all over Pennsylvania and Jersey and out Maryland to fish that in the spring. It's a nuclear, it's thermally enriched because it cools a nuclear plant, but it's an excellent bass fishery, and people come from all over to fish it. So and because there's guides, there's ramps and fish houses, and people who make their living on that lake, outfitters. That to me, that elevates its stature. So we survey that resource every year. Some lakes maybe you get once every 4 or 5, even 6 years. If they're a municipal lake, a water supply, the fishery never changes. So anyway, we have to keep that in mind when we're setting up our rotation because of that narrow survey window.
Sure. Wow. Gosh, that's quite a bit. So now I understand, the fish species and everything too, but do you ever look at external factors too, like, vegetation or like other external factors too? Like, are you looking for like pollutants or any other things like that during your surveys?
Typically, when we do our surveys, we're just interested in the fisheries aspect of it. We have a sister agency here in Virginia called DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. They are more in charge of making sure the water is clean or free of pollutants.
Gotcha.
So they've got very stringent recommendations or regulations that go along with called state water quality standards. And if a resource is listed as impaired, then there have to be steps taken to try to correct that action and bring that water into a non-impaired status. And then there's also the Virginia Department of Health we work with, collecting fish, like for instance, snakeheads, very, very high profile fish now in Virginia and the mid-Atlantic and also Midwest. And we're pushing people to eat snakeheads and blue catfish. And we want to be sure that these fish are safe to eat since we're pushing people to eat them. So we have done extra surveys with VDA and DEQ to make sure that these fish are low in contaminants, PCBs, mercury, things primarily we're looking for. And honestly, the snakeheads are some of the cleanest fish we've ever seen. And I think that's because they feed lower in the food chain, and they're eating very small banded killifish. Because of their habitat, they just eat whatever's in front of their face. Even if it's a really big snakehead, they're still eating these little minnows. So they're not bioaccumulating, and they grow pretty rapidly too. So they're not bioaccumulating the PCBs like maybe some of the bigger blue catfish might be, which is a concern on larger blue catfish in the tidal systems we're in the east side of Virginia.
Gosh, wow. Lots of different factors to kind of
we get a lot going on.
Yeah, there sure is. Now, we had Scylla on, and she was definitely talking about, the snakehead and everything and how you guys were kind of pushing to, get people to, catch them and eat them. They're not bad or anything, but I know they were kind of frowned upon when they were first, introduced in a sense, because they weren't sure like how they were going to affect, the food chains and everything. I don't know if you want to maybe give some more insight into that.
Well, I could probably talk for 4 or 5 hours just about snakeheads and the way they kind of broke onto the scene. And but I'll try to encapsulate it into maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Essentially, in 2004, they showed up in 2004 in the tidal Potomac River system. Okay, that spans Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Virginia. And prior to that, they were found in a couple small stormwater ponds in Maryland where they were eradicated. So during the couple-year lead up to 2004, when they were in the tidal Potomac, there was a lot of media focus, attention, some like Hollywood B movies. And,
yes.
Let's just say it was a really good news story, whether you were a radio news outlet, a print news outlet, a blog, whatever, you sunk your teeth into the snakehead story. I think it was on every late night show. It's just a great story because here's these fish that eat people and walk around on land, and it just went, it just went way over the top.
Mm-hmm.
So when they showed up
viral for its time.
Oh, yep. Yes, it absolutely did. So when they showed up in 2004, and we didn't honestly know at that time. All we knew was the hype that was repeated from a comic book strip that became gospel overnight. And so we were like, wow, this is really bad. Well, come to find out over almost 20 years now, it's probably not really bad. We're still a little concerned about if they get into certain systems where we have an endangered species or something. That hasn't happened yet, but people are illegally moving them. We made it. We don't want people moving fish. Period. Any fish. You need authorization to stock anything in public water, and public water is anything basically, other than a pond in your backyard. Yep. So we just don't want. We don't need people moving fish around. So blue catfish and snakeheads are now on the bad list, where it's a class 1 misdemeanor to move those fish. But that being said, people are still moving them. We've only made one case, arrested one person, and convicted that person. But apparently enough of a precedent hasn't been set because people are still, moving them everywhere. The bottom line is now, though, we went from being sort of the heroes when we were out killing a lot of snakeheads to get biological information 15 years ago, to now we're still doing the same thing because we're still trying to track that biological information. I mentioned, a moment ago about relative abundance and size structure. Well, with snakeheads, one of the things we're really trying to figure out is recruitment, that thing about spawning success. And what's that linked to? Is it linked to aquatic vegetation? Is it linked to, some other factor that we don't understand yet because we don't know that much about these fish? And that's a bit of a mystery because we do know that we have very, very strong year classes that persist for years, almost a decade. And we know that we have very weak year classes that persist an equal amount of time, which it's interesting and it's fascinating, from a science perspective. But, why? We don't know why yet. And so we're trying to understand this. And to understand, to try to get at this, we need to know for sure if a fish is 6 years old or 7 years old. Because that's a big difference. Maybe if it was a 7-year-old fish, maybe that was a flood year or a drought year, and vice versa. So that's why when we kill fish, we usually do it to extract the otolith or the ear bone. Some people make jewelry out of them from like a big drum or something. The sand and the drum family, they have huge otoliths. And the otoliths are pretty cool. They're just a calcified structure that, just bony ivory white. And that's how you age a fish. You don't age fish with scales. We did 30 or 40 years ago, and you'd be better off, throwing darts at a dartboard, blindfold. Yes, the real age of a fish. I mean, you can usually get within 1 or 2 years with a scale, but the older the fish gets, the worse the scales are, especially this far south. The further you go north, where they have a bigger, winter cold season where the fish is not growing at all, works a little better there. But from Virginia south, the scales are terrible. I mean, it's just garbage. So we have to use otoliths, especially when we want to know the exact year the fish will spawn. And so that's one of the reasons we're whacking these fish. So to get back to, I go off on a lot of tangents. So now people see it whacking these fish in the parking lot at the boat ramp, and they're cussing us. They're pissed off because, this guy just drove from Harrisonburg 2 hours away, took the day off to go catch snakeheads in his kayak, and here we are killing them. So he can't catch them. I say, oh, look, buddy, we just got a few. There's still plenty of them out there. Trust me. And there are. I'm not lying. But, I mean, still, it's the visual of us taking his fish. And I get that. I mean, I might be a little pissed off, too, if I drove all that way and saw a bunch of state guys whacking and stacking on the deck of a pickup. So, and I'll offer some fillets. Sir, would you, take some fillets to mitigate your concern? Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. But anyway, we try to educate people, and we try to explain to them what we're doing and why we're doing it. And, that's the bottom line is we still need to figure out where this thing's going. It's only 20 years in. The blue catfish took a lot longer to sort of run their course. But then again, you're dealing with a fish that lives probably 3 or 4 times as long and gets 3 or 4 times as large. So these things all factor into sort of the end run of what a non-native fish is going to do in some novel system where it finds itself.
Gotcha. Wow, this is See, this is the podcast like I've been looking forward to for like, a couple of weeks, because I'm just like I'm ready to pick your brain for some of this like sciencey stuff and everything, because I'm just like, man, what questions am I going to ask him? And then I'm like, well, I'm going to let the conversation go where it's going to go, but then I'm like, oh man, I'm trying to jot some things down for the show notes and everything, but I'm just like I'm getting all these like things in my head too. I'm just like, oh man, what about this? What about this? And so yeah, it's fascinating too. And so like I wanted to ask you about like the different seasons and stuff like that. So because I've noticed we do have like a river system kind of where I live. I'm in central Illinois. And there's what's called the Mackinac River, and it was notorious for flooding. I'd say about a 5 to 7 year span. And now it seems like we've kind of shifted now. We don't necessarily have the flooding springs anymore. And so we had heard that in those 5 to 7 year spans, when it was just constantly flooding, that the smallmouth weren't able to, spawn, or, just didn't have like the spawning grounds to where they could spawn, because it would just flood, and then it'd kind of go down a little bit, maybe they could try and go up and spawn, but then it'd flood again. So I'm curious about what happens during that time frame if a fish is ready to spawn and just there's nowhere to do it because of either A, it's just flooding so much because just the river system and the time of year, like they just don't spawn. Like what happens during those times of years?
Those are very good observations and very good questions. So to try to unpack that. I'm going to look at this two ways. Number one is this whole phenomenon of spring flooding, which is very, very valuable in many systems. Like spring flooding, and it's a highly dynamic in the river system, depending on where you're dealing. Normally, the larger the river system, I'm thinking Mississippi Delta, the more, or even the Nile, places like that was taken away when they created Lake Aswan. But flooding is a dynamic process that nourishes the floodplain and Oxbow River and connections, and can be extremely valuable for certain species recruitment. In other words, without some of these natural processes like flooding, you typically have poor recruitment. But it's highly variable depending on the system and the species. So to look at a smallmouth bass scenario, which you mentioned here in Virginia, I was working with a peer of mine named Scott Smith 10 to 15 years ago, and we started noticing that some years in Virginia, our smallmouth rivers had very poor recruitment. And then we noticed after a period of time, we started getting complaints from anglers. Fishing's terrible. What are you guys going to do about this? Or how can we fix this? And at that time, we didn't really know what was going on. And Scott initiated with several of us in our own respective rivers in our districts to start doing some more investigations using those otoliths, because again, we have to know exactly what year that fish was spawned to try to correlate it with the flows in the river system. And we were able to produce a model for 3 different rivers we worked on: the James, the Shenandoah, and the Rappahannock. Those are 3. The new river in Virginia is probably that's the only of the 3 I just mentioned where smallmouth bass are native. So many of the fish that we love and hold near and dear to our hearts here in Virginia are not native to Virginia. Largemouth, most of Virginia is not native largemouth, not native smallmouth, crappie. I mean, all those fish that, anyway, going off another tangent, but suffice it to say that what we found out was so simple that when we tried to publish a manuscript, the editors didn't believe it. It's like, oh, no. It's gotta be, you don't have enough covariates in here. This has to be more complicated. There's no way it's as simple. But we finally convinced them because we had 3 rivers. And all we had to do was look at, depending on the river, it was either median June flow or median May flow in this James River. The other 2 were June. So but bottom line is, if you looked at the river flows in May or June, when the fish are going on the beds or on the beds and nursing the fry, it's a Goldilocks principle. If you had a normal flow regime in that river system, you got a good year class. If you had a flood or drought, you got nothing or next to nothing. It sucked. And it was really easy to understand. And then we went back and started looking at that. And then we got to where we could predict it based on the flows in either May or June, depending on the river. We could dictate when we went out in September and October to catch those little 50, 60 millimeter baby smallmouth bass. We call them yoys, young of the year. we could predict how many we would get with a respectable confidence interval per hour of electrofishing effort. And that was fantastic because then we knew what was happening. We could explain to anglers, well, look, this is what's happening. This is why you're fishing socks now, because 5 years ago we had a terrible year class, and 4 years ago we had a terrible year class, and 3 years ago we had an average year class. So, normally Mother Nature, she's going to throw you an S-bomb, every 3 or 4 years, and that's fine. You make up for that if you have good ones on either side of it, because when you're catching, if you're out there largemouth fishing or smallmouth fishing, you're typically the fish that you're catching, the 12 to 20 inch fish, those are probably composed of about 4 or 5 year classes. So if you got a bad year class in there, 1 or 2, it's not a big deal. But we had a situation in the tidal Rappahannock and a lot of our tidal systems, because of floods and droughts that overlapped for almost 5 years. We had 4 complete failures in 1 barely average year. So when you put that jagged hole in the fishery and then fast forward about 4 years down the road, there's no fish to catch for tournament anglers or whoever. And that's when they're screaming bloody murder. So that's exactly what happened. So how do you remediate that? So what we're trying to do is raise enough smallmouth bass so we know, like say, we know we've already got 2 bad year classes out of 3, and it's a drought this spring. Well, maybe we can raise enough fish to stock this fall to make up for that. And that's what we're trying to do. Smallmouth bass are one of the notoriously hardest fish to rear in a hatchery situation, but we're trying. We tried it with largemouth, and it's in some cases, it's worked really well with largemouth. In some cases, it's been a waste of money. Conventional wisdom for remedial stocking, that is stocking hatchery fish on an existing wild population, conventional wisdom on remedial stocking of black bass, which includes largemouth and smallmouth, is primarily a waste of money and time. We got in a little bit of a contest with a group here about this exact scenario I just mentioned, where we had 5 years really pretty much bad, and they wanted us to stock fish immediately. And we said, it's a waste of your time. And they went out and they raised a bunch of money, and they handed us a huge check. And they said, we want you to stock fish now. What do you do with that?
Right. Yeah. You're just like,
so we said, look, as long as we can tell these fish apart from these hatchery fish, because if any stocking program, you have to be able to discern the wild from the stocked.
yes.
Back in the day, I'm talking about something that happened 15 to 20 years ago. The only thing to do was either immerse them in a bath of oxytetracycline, which stains their otolith. So when you look at it under UV light, it looks different than a normal otolith. So that's one way to mark them. You can put a little piece of metal in their snout. That's another way to mark them. It's a pain in the ass to scan them with a wand.
Yeah.
And it's a pain in the ass to mark them in the hatchery. It's easier to put them in a bath of OTC. So that's what they did with these hatchery fish. They put them in a bath of OTC. They stocked them out in a smaller river than they wanted, because they didn't have enough money to put them in the river they wanted. But in order to make a difference, you had to have enough fish. And, we're talking, 6 figures fish here, hundreds of thousands of fish. And so, but when the bottom line was, in the system that we tried that first time on, that was published. It was the most successful remedial black bass stocking ever. Well, in a tidal river ever, and maybe ever. So then they were like, oh yeah, see, we told you guys, you need to stock fish. We're like, okay, yeah, it actually worked. Thank you very much for that. And then we tried it on some different systems, and it was a failure, just like the conventional literature. So the bottom line is, one thing I've learned through this process is that Mother Nature, anything's possible. So you never say never with anything. Things can always work. So anyway, so we all learned something from that. The fishing got better, and honestly, the one of the rivers that we didn't stock, that we told everybody was going to be back, is now one of the best rivers in the state, and it was never stocked. So it's just, Mother Nature will heal itself many times.
Wow. That's pretty amazing that you guys can, and hearing about it and thinking about it, it kind of basically is that simple, when you really think about it, just, the weather patterns. Was it a flood year? Was it a drought year? Human nature, we always want to put more to it. It's just like, oh, well, it's got to be more than that. Surely there was something else going on. We always want to put more to it. But, simplicity is, well, hey, just, yeah, it was flooding. That's basically all there was to it, in a sense. That's very, very interesting. Um, uh, Gosh, what was I going to say? I had a good thought that I
most of these freshwater fisheries, especially the black bass fisheries, are regulated primarily through environmental factors. People ask me a lot about bed fishing or taking guard males off of nests, and it seems counterintuitive many times, but in most cases it doesn't matter. The year class is going to be set based on environmental conditions. What happens to that fish or this fish? It doesn't matter in the wash. It comes out. It's either going to be a good year or a bad year. And those fishermen, the angler behaviors, really in the end, don't make much difference. It's the environment, and usually that comes down to flows. If you're in a tidal system, salinity comes into play. Habitat is in SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation, comes into play. Nutrients, zooplankton, when the fish hatch, is there adequate zooplankton, based on nitrogen and phosphorus in the system. So all these things are environmentally related. It's not something we, as anglers, you control through angler behavior. That's why I've never been a fan of catch and release during spawning times or spawning sanctuaries. All these things, in my opinion, especially in my part of the world, they're completely meaningless.
Huh. Very interesting. Definitely some food for thought, And, I've not really been like a big, like, bed fishing angler myself, mainly because the waters that I fish, it's very like staying dirty water. So like I can't necessarily like sight fish for bed fishing and whatnot. But I've definitely heard, people going back and forth. Well, you shouldn't, focus on bed fishing. It's gonna, mess with, the fish and all this and whatnot, And I was gonna ask you too, so like in boat tournaments and stuff like that, you have bass that, will be caught in some areas or whatnot. Will bass always stay in one area? Will they always go back to the same area? Do they cruise around? Like, what's your input on that?
That's probably been one of the most studied aspects of fisheries science. If you go to the journals, like, so we have a professional society called American Fisheries Society, and we publish several journals in the AFS. One of them is called the North American Journal of Fisheries Management. Anybody can go to AFS. It's called fisheries.org. And you don't even need to be a member. You just go to fisheries.org and you can search the North American Journal of Fisheries Management for tournament fish release, or just come up with your own phrase. And you can look at all the abstracts without even paying anything or being a member. You can see all the abstracts from these peer-reviewed published papers that are out there and see for yourselves, all the different studies that have been done for many, many years, decades, on big tournament fisheries. And primarily these are Southeast U.S., but other places as well, natural lakes up north. And this is overly simplistic, but what I try to explain to people, sort of, if you try to synthesize, a guy named Gene Wild out of Texas did a really good job synthesizing tournament bass papers about 10 years ago. We call it like a meta examination. And bottom line is about a third of them return to where they were caught. About a third of them go somewhere completely different, and about a third of them kind of stay near where they're released. That's the simplest way sort of to describe it. Of course, it could be vastly different depending on the scenario. But if you had to distill it into something fairly succinct, that would be it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, these tournaments are happening. Like I mentioned earlier, Lake Anna. It's just an unbelievable number of tournaments. There's probably 6 or 8 major access points where tournament weigh-ins occur. And we don't make any effort to redistribute fish as a state agency. And most of the anglers, I don't think they have a redistribution vessel. Some places do, I know, in other states, but we don't. in that fishery, the mortality rate in that fishery is among the lowest I've ever seen. The longevity of those fish are as great as I've ever seen. And the fishery right now is as good as it's ever been. And I've been managing it for almost 30 years. And it's just an inordinate amount of tournament activity. So, a lot of times we have issues with guides, picking fights with tournaments, trying to point fingers. Or you're hurting the resource doing this and that. And honestly, in most black bass fisheries now, and I think that holds true for even, in the Midwest, the voluntary release rates are so high that there's essentially no impact from any delayed harvest. I mean, you're going to have, when you have a tournament and you go through that and you're, carrying around hundreds of fish in bags, there's going to be some delayed mortality from that. But what you have to look at is that more, because there's a certain amount of natural mortality in any population. Okay. And every year in bass population and water body X, there's going to be somewhere between a 15 and 25% natural mortality rate. So what you have to look at from these tournaments, even if it's 99+% release, which is what we see, is the mortality that's related to stress, handling, hook and release. Is that either additive to the natural mortality or is it compensatory? Are those fish that are going to die anyway? And in most cases, it's compensatory. Those fish are going to die anyway. So the fish that die in the population are already gone. It doesn't matter. It's a wash. Occasionally, if you have a really poorly run tournament or in a given scenario, maybe where the water quality is not good, or, you can sort of pick your theory of what's happening, you could have additive mortality from an event. So it's not unheard of, but in most cases, at least in my experience, additive mortality is not the case. It's compensatory mortality. So we can rest easy that what we're doing as tournament groups and resource managers, this is not hurting the resource. It's just fine.
Sure. Awesome. Definitely awesome food for thought there. I've never done like boat tournaments or anything per se. I've only done things from the kayak perspective. And in the kayak, we're all catch, photo, release, so that's, kind of what I've been used to. But I've definitely, seen the boat weigh-ins and stuff like that. So I've always definitely been curious, thinking about some of these different things and whatnot, and heard, different tales and whatnot. Well, you got to do this to the fish in the live well, make sure they stay alive and make sure you do all these different things. Then I've heard the stories of people pouring, Sprite or Coke on them to revive them and stuff like that. I'm just like, man, what's up with all that? I mean, I can kind of get it with like, if they got them from lower in the lake and brought them up with it, being 20-degree difference, stuff like that, oxygen levels, stuff like that. I'm sure there's different sciences when it comes to those types of things too.
The biggest thing is just for people to try to avoid having tournaments in the hottest parts of the year.
Yes.
That because most people, some people don't know, the warmer the water, the lower the oxygen, physiologically, the less oxygen that can be in that water. And so fish just are more prone to stress in warm water. So anytime the water temperature gets above the mid 80s, it's just not a good idea to have tournaments. Just have, do something else for a month or 2 months when the water temperatures are that high. But other than that, they're pretty resilient.
Yep. Awesome. So I wanted to kind of jump back a little bit, talking about like, native species to Virginia. How and when were, like bass and other species introduced into, the different lakes and streams? And I guess like why? Was it more of was some of it accidental? Was some of it, just for the sport, type thing? What's the primary purpose of, the non-native fish being introduced?
Unfortunately, perhaps, and most likely, fisheries management, which is what I do now, 100 years ago was let's put fish in this big tub on a railroad car and ship it this way 400 or 500 miles, and whatever water body we find, we're going to throw those fish in there and see what happens. That's what people did. That was fisheries management. The federal government did that. That's why we have smallmouth bass everywhere we have them, and largemouth bass and black crappie and rainbow trout. That was fisheries management. There was literally no thought given to native species, any consequence from invasive action. People just put fish in transport and put them wherever they could. Johnny Appleseed, fish everywhere. Honestly, that's what that. And so even as late as the 1970s, we had people in my agency. That's how blue catfish got distributed all over in the mid-Atlantic, was because somebody, thought it would be a good idea to put blue catfish in the tidal river. At that point, striped bass stocks were down a little bit, and I guess they were looking for some other, potential trophy, which, you can go out and catch 150, 160-pound fish. That's kind of cool. But they did the Johnny Appleseed with blue catfish in all of Virginia tidal tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay. And now they're in the Potomac now. We didn't put them there, but they got there on their own, or somebody moved them there. Either one, they probably both. But bottom line is, it took 30 years for that nexus to be fully revealed, because that fish is such a long-lived fish, and for the population to reach some equilibrium, which apparently it has. It's like snakeheads hit it in about 10 years. Blue cats, it took 30. And the numbers seem to be dropping a little bit. But anyway, it's still like, I think the Maryland governor just declared a state of emergency over invasive fish. Blue catfish and snakeheads are destroying our universe. It's like, okay. But the bottom line is, they're being caught by commercial fishermen. They're making money from those fish. I'm not saying it was a good thing they were introduced, but it happened. And at the time, it was sort of the way things work. Now, we would never in this day and age make a introduction like that, given that species wasn't present in the system, or without any thought or care for our native or beneficial naturalized species. So even now, when the snakehead just showed up 20 years ago, people are screaming about, well, we need to protect the largemouth bass, all our native fish. And I'm like, well, largemouth aren't native. And the people go really surprised when I tell them largemouth bass aren't native. They're like, no, well, they've been here since 1880, when somebody brought them here on a rail car. And so we think of them as native, but probably in 1880, they were really damn invasive. Whatever was here back then probably didn't take kindly to this monster fish, like just sucking everything up, which I'm sure they did back then. But they've done well. And of course, they're, the number one game fish in the world. And so, I think 70% of our anglers fish for largemouth bass at one time or another. So, it's obviously it's the bread and butter sport fish on the planet. So, we want to take care of managing them properly, but at the same time, recognize that they're pretty badass fish in and of their own right, and can hold up against any snakehead, as Lake Biwa in Japan, fisheries management can attest to. They had their beautiful snakehead population for 100 years, and then some idiot induced largemouth bass, and the snakeheads took a nosedive, and they hate the largemouth bass. So there you go.
Wow, that's crazy. I did not know that about the whole, let's put them in a rail car and just go across the country and just throw them in a pond here. That's, it doesn't surprise me, by all means. It doesn't surprise me at all, but that kind of blows my mind a little bit. It's just like, oh, hey, here's a lake over here. Let's just throw some fish in here and see what happens.
Go forth and do God's work.
Right. Yeah. That's the American way almost, in a sense, It's just, wow. Oh man, gosh, that's wild. Let's see here. Gosh, what else do I want to ask you? I guess maybe what unique experiences or encounters have you had while out in the field? Maybe like, I don't know if you've had like scary encounters or awesome encounters, or just like, oddball ones, or just, anything goes or whatnot. What have been some really interesting stories?
Well, as you can imagine, people always ask. I do a lot of demonstrations and teach classes. A lot of times we'll use our survey gear or electrofishing boat. And when people first hear about water and electricity, they're always a little sketched out. It's like we've always heard that isn't really a good combination. Valid. And so probably, when you asked about weird experiences or scary, we were on a river survey in 20 years ago. And we had we were doing a smallmouth bass survey on the Rappahannock River right near I-95 in Fredericksburg near my office. And we had a bunch of people. We call this a depletion survey. So I mentioned this whole relative abundance idea when we do a survey and we can tell you how many fish per hour we catch. With this kind of survey, we're trying to deplete all the fish within a sample reach of the river. And then we theoretically catch every fish. Or if we don't, we model it out so we did. And then we can tell you exactly how many fish are in that reach of river. And if we do 3 or 4 reaches of river, we can average that in the whole river system, and we can come up with a realistic estimate of how many smallmouth bass are in this whole river, which is pretty meaningful information.
Yeah.
So anyway, we were doing one of the first ones of these we ever did. In fact, we published a paper on this too. It was pretty cool in that North American Journal. Because people back in those days were doing depletions on little tiny streams. They were trying to deplete a big river system right above the tide. And we were doing that. And we were coming up with some pretty neat info. But we were also near the fall line, which is where the physiographic provinces join. So you have the Piedmont meeting the coastal plain, which is where the head of the tide is. And so a lot of times right in that area, you've got a lot of like riffles and rapids and braids and like stuff you think about kayaking through, not necessarily slowly floating through. Mm-hmm. And we were coming upstream and we hit essentially a block where everybody had to get out of the boat. And these are relatively lightweight electrofishing boats, John boats that are like 14 feet, generator, pulse box. And we were all prepared to get out with chest waders on and push this boat around these blockages. This one guy who was my boss's friend at the time, he didn't have chest waders on, and he'd gotten out to help push. And then we had an intern that wasn't familiar with the boat we were on because it was not our boat. And we have a couple safety devices, but the driver had not shut off the pulse box, and there was no foot pad on the front of the deck, which this intern was used to the foot pad on the deck. So when the intern jumped back in the boat, he went up on the deck of the boat, and the thing was still running, and the guy got in the back. And then when this other person was still in the water and went to get in the boat, he touched the boat and essentially connected the circuit, and he got laid out like a fish. And he literally turned white as a ghost. And I was scared. I jumped out. He was stiff. He was like literally stiff. I dragged him up on a sandbar, and I was about to administer CPR, and he woke up and said, "Please don't do that."
Oh, gosh. Oh, man. Ooh. Got a little stunned there. Holy cow.
Yeah, he was, and he did go to the doctor the next day and got checked out, and he was okay, but he was white as he could be, man. It's a good thing he didn't have a pacemaker, I think.
Yeah.
But it was a good lesson for everybody, because we went over it that night and basically figured out what went wrong and why it went wrong, and different staff, unfamiliarity with the gear, using different people's gear, and it's sort of one of those crisis situations. Everybody feels like, oh, I got to help out, I got to get out, help push or whatever, and just perfect storm. But luckily, it didn't go bad.
Right. Yeah. Oof, man. Still though, yeah, it's just like, oh man, that.
It was cool though when he woke up. Yeah.
Yeah, just like, oh, don't do that.
Please don't do that. I mean, I was about this close, mouth to mouth on. Like 15, but see, I was on the old school. I'd still do 15 compressions to 2 breaths. I think now they say no breaths, but I'm still 15. I'll never get over 15.
They've changed it so much. It was 15 to 2, then it was 30 to 2, and then now it's just compression. Yeah, I know. And it depends which agency. It's either if you get certified with American Heart, or if you do what's the other one, like Red Cross or something like that.
Red Cross is what we do.
Yeah. So yeah, it depends. So yeah, they're all different. So Anywho, yeah, this has been definitely some very awesome information. Let's see here. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to ask you here. Wow, this is great stuff. I love it. I know before we start recording, you don't have like a social media presence or whatnot, which is totally fine. But if people wanted to look up maybe more about the Virginia oh my gosh, DWR, or maybe find some of the data that you might collect or whatnot, where can folks maybe look up some of that at? Is there like a website?
DWR.virginia.gov. And they'll get there, and then there's a place they can go and just say, hey, please send this to John Odenkirk, and or whatever they may have any question, it'll get routed to the appropriate place.
Okay. Awesome. Good stuff. Well, do you have anything else that you want to share? Or I guess one other question I wanted to have is, to anglers out there who are maybe wanting to, maybe do more as far as like, helping fish species, conservation, that type of stuff. Do you have any suggestions or anything for folks who are listening?
What I've really found helpful throughout my career are catch records from either individuals or from clubs. If you can keep track, and you need to quantify, the most important part is quantifying your effort, because the catch data mean almost nothing unless we have some context of effort, how much time was spent in this pursuit. So if you just keep like a small journal of how many hours on a given resource, and then how many fish of whatever species you caught and released or caught and kept, and then the rough sizes. That information is very, very, we call that a creel survey if we're doing it officially and interviewing anglers at a boat ramp or wherever a roving is going from boat to boat or person to person along a river. But typically it's an access point creel survey. But if you just keep your own personal journal and can provide that to your local biologist, that is really helpful and meaningful, because that's a piece of information that we don't get when we're out there, surveying and getting the fishery dependent data. What size, how many are there, but we're not getting, for the anglers, how many are you catching and what size are they? And sometimes they match up, but sometimes they don't. And then sort of in your satisfaction, do you think this is good or bad or whatever. So that information is very helpful for us. And so if you can kind of keep that in a simple tabulated format, and then, let that be available, that's wonderful stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I know a lot now with the kayak fishing tournaments. We use mainly two different platforms now. There's Tourney X, and now there's Fishing Chaos. And I know that data, so everything is done by fish length, which I know was probably pretty helpful for you guys. So I know all of that. So each angler that submits a fish, it'll download all of the fish that they caught, even if it got cold. It'll download all that data, and then if needed to, we can get the GPS location that we can submit to local fish biologists too. So that's definitely good to know too. That
Thank you.
Submit that to our local fish biologists. Very helpful. Awesome, good stuff. Anything else that you wanted to share with us? Just
thank you for allowing me the option to be on your platform.
Yes, and thank you. Definitely lots of awesome information here. Yes, love it so much. Thank you again for being on here. And so guys, thanks again for joining us on another episode of Bass Fishing for Noobs, where we give you the tricks, the techniques, and tips to help you rip more lips. And I totally messed that up like I know I would. But that's how it goes. So we'll see you guys next time on the next show. Have a good night.
Good luck, Sean.